Hey everyone, I'm back with a new tutorial. Okay, so today I want to share 20 tips to master Claude Code while building a real app. And, as a parent, I'm always looking for fun, family-friendly activities nearby. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a family activity finder like this that shows upcoming local events personalized to your location, schedule, and interests. And while building this, we're going to try to cover all 20 of these tips so that you'll know every essential Claude Code feature to plan, code, and debug apps. I only decided to make this tutorial after spending a full month with Claude Code, so I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so let's start with a brand new project. We call it Family Activity Demo, and I have it open up an empty folder in Cursor here. And just as a reminder, you can install Claude Code by simply pasting this line here. Now, since I have it installed already, all I have to do is type Claude to open Claude Code. All right. So proceed. And there we go. We have Claude Code open. Okay. So the very first tip is to use plan mode before coding. If you just remember one tip, make it this one. The more time you spend planning, the more likely Claude will succeed. And I always press Shift Tab to cycle to plan mode. And if Claude, for some reason, asks to start coding, I always hit Escape to cancel. So think of Claude like an overeager engineer that you really have to rein in all the time, right? So now you see here, let's press Shift Tab, and now we're in plan mode. Okay, so let's move on to the next tip, which is to ask Claude to explore solutions with you. So the first thing I like to do in plan mode is to ask Claude to explain the code base. And then I'll tell it, I want to build this feature. Can you explore solutions starting with the simplest one? The whole idea is to collaborate with Claude to come up with the plan first before coding. So I have a prompt here where I'm going to tell Claude I want to build a family-friendly activity finder, and parents can enter their city, kids' age, when they're free, how far they'll drive, and any other preferences. And then the app will search for weekend activities nearby and return 5 recommendations with bold titles. And let's also add an emoji and 2 to 4 sentences description each. All right, so let's paste this into Claude Code and see what it comes up with. And remember, we're still in plan mode here. Okay, so Claude has come up with 3 different solutions. And you notice here that's asking to start coding again. And again, you gotta hit no. I want to keep planning. It's just way too overeager to start coding. Let's actually read through what it came up with. Let's scroll up. Okay, so solution 1 is using a static database with client-side filtering. Okay, so we've got hard code activities. Solution 2 is using a third-party API like Google Places, Eventbrite, Meetup. The problem with this solution is that, local activities are very fragmented. It can come from like multiple places, Eventbrite, Patch, and other websites. So we're gonna have to hook up a lot of different APIs, which is a lot of work, right? And solution 3 is Claude Messages API with smart recommendations. Because we're trying to do a demo for Claude Code, I think this makes a lot of sense. It's the most AI-powered solution, but really it's just, calling the Claude API and using the web search tool to look up recent activities. Okay, so now we have 3 different solutions. And now let's go back to our tips. Very important. When you want to work with Claude Code, you want to follow the spec, to-do, and code process. So after exploring and selecting a solution with Claude, I like to ask it to create a spec with the requirements, tech stack, design guidelines, and up to 3 milestones to execute. And then I go even further by reviewing the spec, making sure it's correct and simplified, and then asking Claude to create a to-do list for the first milestone. So I'm always auditing and reviewing Claude's plans in each step, right? So now let's go ahead and ask Claude to make a spec. So again, I have a prompt here, create a spec.md with requirements, tech stack, design guidelines, up to 3 milestones. Keep it as simple as possible. For milestone 1, let's just set up the UI with dummy data. And for milestone 2, let's connect to Claude API with a web search tool. And I've linked the documentation here. Let's load it up. So Claude has this web search tool that can search the internet. And I've did some research ahead of time for this. But you can also just ask Claude, how to implement this stuff, and it'll probably point to one of these documentation sources. So let's go ahead and paste this prompt into Claude to create the spec. And let's actually go a step further and copy this image into Claude as well. So it has a reference point, right? So just press Ctrl V to paste the image into Claude. Okay, so now Claude is going to go ahead and write a spec.md file, and let's see what it comes up with. All right, it looks like Claude has created a spec. Let's take a look. Here we are, Family Activity Finder. The whole point of this thing is to actually review the requirements in detail and edit it to simplify it, because Claude likes to build more than you ask for, and just make sure that it's accurate and what you actually want, right? So for example, here it's saying the app returns 5 personalized activity recommendations with engaging descriptions, and we should add a relevant emoji icon, right? And then here we are, inputs. Okay. All these are required. And let's just make this simple. Let's just make all these text inputs. Text input for day and time preference. We can keep this maximum distance as a slider. And then here we have a text input again. All right. And here's the output format. Yep, this looks right. The distance from user city might be hard to do, but let's see what it comes up with. And here is our front end, our back end, and our development tools. Okay, this looks right. Design guidelines look right. Things look pretty good. Okay, now here's the important part, the milestones, where it actually starts building stuff. So, like we asked for it to do, the first step is just to create the UI with dummy data, which seems mostly accurate. And then we're going to hook up to Claude API integration, right? And let's just go ahead back here and just copy this documentation again. So it has a framework reference. Use for implementing messages, API, and web search. Okay, and there's some more details down here for milestone 3. And yeah, it's written a pretty good spec. It's probably written a much more detailed spec than I would have written by hand. But there's one thing that's missing here. What do you guys think it is? I think because we're using Claude Messages API, we need to have a prompt to actually call the API with the inputs that we have and get the recommendations back. So let's actually ask Claude. Let's go back to our tutorial and ask Claude to create a prompt.md file with the prompt that we're going to use for milestone 2, where we call the API. Okay, so let's go ahead and ask Claude to do that. Now it's going to create a prompt, and let's see what it comes up with. All right, we're back, and Claude has created a prompt file. And here we are, system prompt, your family activity recommendations expert. Here we go. Return exactly 5 in the following format. Yep, this seems right. Let's make sure that it's current and let's say it's timely, because we don't want to return like generic attractions information, right? We want to return timely events. Okay, so now let's go back to our thing, and now we're going to ask it to create a to-do list with tasks from milestone 1. Remember, we're trying to follow the spec, to-do, and code process here. These are the 2 critical steps before we actually start getting into code. All right, so let's go ahead and paste this here. Let's also make sure that the spec includes details to use the prompt for milestone 2. Okay, we're very much still in planning mode, just writing like documents. We haven't written any code yet. But again, the more you plan, the more likely Claude is to actually build the code without any errors. Especially for people who are like not super technical like myself, it's very important to do the planning step first. So let's come back once Claude actually finishes the to-do list. Okay, so Claude has created a to-do list. Let's take a look. Again, the goal here is to audit the list to make sure it actually makes sense. So milestone 1, we're going to make the UI with dummy data. Everything here looks right, so install a bunch of dependencies. Yep, this looks all good. Yep. Add clear button functionality, add results. And I mean, this is quite a long list, but things look pretty good to me. Now, before we get Claude Code, let's actually do a few more tips, okay? So my next tip number 4 is to use output styles to learn while building. So you can type /output style explanatory to get Claude to add insight boxes that explain why it made each choice so that you can learn to read code and understand the tech architecture better while it's building. You can also type output style learning, and Claude will actually make you write pieces of code so that you can even learn and get hands-on practice. Now, because we're lazy, we're just going to type output style explanatory because I don't actually want to code by myself. So let's go ahead and turn it on. And now we've set the output style to explanatory. This is a really good option that the Claude Code team built for folks who just want to learn while building. And now Claude will add insight boxes as we ask it to do stuff. Okay, but let's go further, right? Let's go cover tips number 5 and 6 as well. Tip number 5 is you can use this Claude.md file to bootstrap your project understanding. So you can type /init in Claude Code to have Claude scan the code base and create a detailed Claude.md file with project context, patterns, and key files. And this file becomes Claude's memory for every future conversation, okay? So let's go ahead and just ask Claude to create a Claude.md file. But actually, I'm going to ask it to create an empty Claude.md file because we don't actually have any code here right now. So let's create an empty Claude.md file. Okay. And the reason I want to create an empty file is because of the next step, which is I want to add my personal preferences to Claude. So you can also add your personal preferences on how you want Claude to respond to your Claude.md file. Here's the thing I'm going to copy and paste into Claude. I'm a PM with limited coding experience. When you're coding or doing your work, please share tips that explain the tech architecture and any changes that you're making and why. Okay, let's paste it right here. And there we go. I think that should work. All right, so we've done all the prep work. And now we can finally move on to actually getting Claude to code. And here's tip number 7. Use voice to give Claude context faster, right? So I've interviewed a lot of great engineers like Kieran and other folks, and a lot of times they don't really type anymore. Instead, they use voice tools like Whisperflow and Monologue to dictate to Claude directly. And speaking naturally often results in more detailed instructions for Claude that helps it produce better output. Okay, so definitely use your voice. And speaking of that, let's cover tip number 8 too, which is to get your app running as soon as possible. I specifically asked it to just build a UI first with dummy data as the first milestone, because I want to see the app live as soon as possible, right? So that, when I make subsequent changes, like hooking up to Claude API, I can actually see the app update in real time. So here I have a prompt, build milestone 1 based on to-do file and run localhost. Localhost is basically just running the app locally on your machine, right? So that you can see it live. So instead of copying this in, I'm just going to voice dictate to Claude. And I have Whisperflow installed. So all I have to do is press Control to dictate stuff into Claude. So let's say, build milestone 1 based on the todo.md file, and then run localhost. And also uses image as your reference. All right, here we go. Here's the voice. And it's not quite perfect, so let's edit it. Build milestone 1 using todo and file and run localhost. Also use an image as the reference. And let's go back and just pasting our image here. Let's copy image and paste it here. Okay. Use this image as reference. Okay, great. All right, so now Claude is finally going to code milestone 1, which is to set up the UI and just use dummy data on our local recommendations. And let's see if Claude can come up with this in one shot. Okay, so Claude is installing a bunch of dependencies. And while it's coding, I want to quickly cover tip number 9, which is press escape if Claude is going off the rails to stop and redirect Claude. So at any time while Claude is coding here, it's asking to install a bunch of stuff, you can just hit escape and it will stop whatever Claude is doing. And it's not going to lose the context. This is very useful if you see Claude going down the wrong path or doing more than you want it to do. So don't be afraid to hit escape, right? if it's doing the wrong thing. All right, so now let's come back whenever Claude finishes actually building milestone 1. Okay, I came back real quick. Claude is still working through his to-do list, But you see now that it's sharing these insights because we changed the output style to explanatory. So we can learn as we build apps, right? And there's some other insights up here. So, if you're new to coding, if you're trying to learn to become more technical, I definitely recommend using the explanatory output style and also updating your Claude.md to ask it to over-explain stuff. All right, we'll come back once it's finished coding. Okay, Claude claims that it's finished coding, and now there's a localhost link. But you know what? When I load the localhost link, absolutely nothing shows up. So I want to show you kind of these bugs because it's not perfect, right? So what's going on here? It's not loading anything. And let's actually go ahead and go back to our tips, and let's skip ahead to the section on debugging. So there's kind of two tips on debugging. One is to ask Claude to think ultra hard, or why do you think this happened, to help you debug bugs, right? So think ultra hard basically gets Claude to think longer before coding. And why do you think this happened causes it to try to root cause the issue more, right? And of course, really good best practice is to just give very specific feedback, to attach images, and to look at browser console logs to help Claude debug issues. The more context Claude has, the more likely it is to figure out what went wrong. So here, we don't really have an image. It's just a blank screen, right? But let's go ahead and inspect here. And let's see if there's any kind of console bugs. And lo and behold, there is. See, there's an uncaught error. And there's something going on here. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this bug into Claude. And let's say I only see a blank screen. Think ultra hard on why this happened. And here's a bug I see in the console. Let's go ahead and paste this bug. All right, so giving Claude a lot of context, we've asked it to use a lot of tokens and think ultra hard. And hopefully now it can fix the bug. And then we'll come back later to see if it fixed it or not. All right, we're back. Let's take a look at our app now. And here we go. It looks like the UI is working. Zoom in a little bit. I can enter a city, kid ages, availability, distance, and preferences. And okay, I can search, and a bunch of activities load. Now, these activities are, again, dummy data. They're not using a real API because we're still on milestone 1. It looks great. There's a bunch of emojis. And yeah, overall, it seems to work well. So let's go back to our Claude Code. And let's actually ask Claude to check things off in todo.md that are done for milestone 1, and also add to-dos for milestone 2, which, if you recall, is hooking up the Claude API and the web search tool. So, we want to make sure our to-do list is up to date as we build more and more milestones. And while it's doing that, let me talk about something else. So let's go back to our tips. Let's go back here. And let's talk about tip number 10. So far, we've just been kind of like asking Claude to code, right? But I think it's really important to add version control with GitHub integration. I like to save changes to GitHub after each milestone. GitHub basically provides version control so that you can revert to a previous version of your code base if things get messed up, which they will inevitably happen with AI, right? And let's go to our GitHub. And here I am going to create a new repository. Let's give it the same name, family activity demo. So if GitHub's new to you, it's not too complicated. Just create a new account right here. And then there's a button to create a new repository, and then just hit create. So after you create the repo, there's a link to the repo here. So you can just go into Claude Code and link this project to this repo that I've created. And, it's sharing some insights about how Git works, and it's like asking for permissions to link to the repo, and it wants to make an initial commit. So it wants to commit the code to the repository. There's also another way to do it, which is to type install-github-app and walk through a few steps. But since we created a repo already, we're just going to use the manual way that we did above. So now it's saying that it's pushed the code to GitHub. And let's take a look at our project, refresh. And there we go. We have a bunch of code here, including our specs and to-do, and there's a bunch of code in this folder. So now our code is in GitHub, and we can ask Claude to revert to a previous version or add new commits as we move along. All right, so now what we're going to do next, let's go back to our thing here, and let's talk about tip number 11. You see that Claude keeps asking you more permissions to do stuff, and I have to accept permissions. And this can get pretty annoying, right? So what you can do is you can set up permissions to let Claude work more autonomously. The way it does it is it'll create a Claude.settings file, and where we can grant it all the permissions to read, write, and run specific save commands without having to ask us for permission each time. We can also skip all permissions by just typing dangerously skip permissions. Although, again, I don't recommend this unless you really know what you're doing. So let's go ahead and copy this prompt into Claude, which is to get to create a file to auto-grant permissions. Now, very important, you probably don't want to auto-grant Claude permissions to remove or delete files because that's more dangerous. So I've kind of called that out here. But let's go ahead and paste this in. Okay, Claude has finished creating the settings file. Let's take a look. It's allowing all these different permissions, read, write, so on and so forth, a bunch of get commands. And it wants to deny any kind of remove commands like we asked it to. So there you go. Now we have our permissions file. Now let's go back to our tips list. And before we build milestone 2, let's actually talk about this tip, which is to clear context strategically with clear and compact. Because we spend all this time going back and forth with Claude in the chat window, Claude's context window is probably pretty full by this time. And AI just gets progressively worse as your conversation history gets longer. So let's actually type in compact here to clear the conversation history, but keep a summary in the context, right? Let's go ahead and do that. And we can also use clear, just clear the conversation history in total, but I like to use compact more because then it creates a summary. Okay, so while it's compacting the conversation, let's look at this tip here. I think, again, if you remember one thing from this tutorial is to follow the spec, to-do, and code process with each milestone. So before we build milestone 2 by hooking up the Claude API, let's make sure our to-do list is updated. Check off any completed milestone 1 items and add any milestone 2 items. And I remember we did this before. We asked Claude to do this. Let's just take a look at the to-do list. And you see that it's checked off a bunch of milestone 1 items that are done, and it's added milestone 2 items. And let's just quickly take a look. Yep, this all looks right. Set request body. Very important to ask it to use the web search tool. Set up proper model parameters. For some reason, it wants to use Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is an old model. I don't know why. It should be using really, let's say, Claude 4 Sonnet instead. So again, it's important to review these details so that it actually catches these mistakes, right? And prompt engineering. So again, we already have a prompt template here in prompt.md. So we should ask it to use prompt.md, right? And then go down here, data flow, testing performance, everything else looks pretty good. Okay, so now we've compacted everything. So we have a new conversation here. And let's go ahead and ask it to build milestone 2. So I'm gonna use my voice. Okay, now build milestone 2 by following our to-do.md file very closely. And one more thing before we start. So for milestone 2, we're going to need to have a Claude API key because it's going to call the Claude API, right? Let's go to Claude console here. And here I've set up a couple of API keys here. And I actually have an API key saved here that I can paste in. So use this Claude API key. Okay, so now let's ask it to build. But real quick on API keys. I just briefly flashed my API key on the screen, and you should never do this. You should never share your API key with anyone. So I'm probably going to delete this API key afterwards in case you guys want to charge my Claude account. But you can just go to Claude console, Anthropic console, and create a new key and just name it something. Let's say test key and add, and then it will create a new key here, right? And just copy that into Claude and it will do the work for you. But the important point here is to never share your API key with anyone, and not even your spouse. Keep it secret, because otherwise people will start charging your account. And of course, to actually use this API key, you're going to have to put maybe $5 or something on your Claude account. $5 is worth it if you want to learn how to code with AI. All right. So now Claude is working through the to-do list and it's going to create the backend server and hook up the API. It's going to take a while. So let's skip ahead and see what it comes up with. Okay, let's come back for a little bit. I've been reading what it's doing and it's still trying to use Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is deprecated. So let's actually tell it to use Claude 4 as the model instead. Okay. And again, it's tempting to go off and get a coffee while it's doing all this work, but there is a benefit to sitting around watching a code because you get to learn. It's still sharing these insights with me, right? And you also can see when it's actually going off track, like using an older model. So now it's going to update the model to Claude 4 and hopefully it'll work better. All right, we'll come back when it's done. Okay, it said it's finished all this work. It's checked off all the milestone 2 items and I've tested it here and it is loading results. But the problem is the results are very generic, right? Talking about going to Exploratorium, California Academy of Science. These are just like very generic results. So let's give it some feedback. You're showing generic results like Exploratorium. What I want is more timely and relevant, family-friendly local events like, let's say, Exploratorium after dark, or maybe, Lindy in the park, which is a dance thing. How would you fix this? Let's not accept edits. Let's actually go to plan mode and just ask it how it plans to fix this. Chances are it's probably going to update the prompt, but let's see what it comes up with. Okay, so it's saying proposed solutions, enable Claude's web search tool recommended. So it didn't actually enable the web search tool, even though it was on our to-do list, I'm pretty sure, and it checked it off. So again, you gotta be careful here. It's like an overeager junior engineer that claims it did something, but it actually didn't. It wants to search the web for how to use the web search tool. But we've already given it documentation on how to use the web search tool, right? So let's actually just paste this documentation in, add the web search tool functionality, follow this documentation very closely. There we go. Because otherwise it's going to do a bunch of Google searches and like maybe you'll find a relevant article and maybe not. But we did the research for it. So now hopefully it actually does add the web search functionality. And then we can get more real-time current events. And let's see if it does the job or not. Okay, so coming back briefly, it started to add a bunch of like location and time zone region detection helpers. But in our app here, the user is already providing this information, right? Again, I interrupted its work and I say, hold on, why don't you just use the user's inputs on data and location? Include that part in your prompt. And of course, they said you're absolutely right. And the insight is sometimes the simplest solution is the best. So again, you have to sometimes monitor what Claude is doing and correct it to simplify as much as possible, because otherwise you'll build a bunch of stuff here that makes it overly complicated. All right, so we'll come back again to see if it actually does something good this time.
Okay, everyone, we're back. And I'll be honest with all of you. It took me 10 minutes of going back and forth to get this app to work because there was a bunch of rate limit issues with the Claude API. And you can see here my excitement when we finally got it to work. But basically, I went through the same process of the tips that we covered. I gave a bunch of context on what was going wrong, and I uploaded browser console logs and other things, and I made it update the prompt to be more brief, and eventually we were able to get it working. All right, so without further ado, let's load up our app right here. And you can see here now that I've entered Los Angeles in here and some information, and it's actually pulling up relevant recent events for Los Angeles. So let's just try it again with San Francisco one more time, just to see if it works. And it does take a while to call the Claude API and have it do web searches. So we have to wait a few seconds. Okay, so you see here that it's loaded the events, and these are relevant events. There's Golden Gate Parks, there's a Whale's Tail event happening, Muni Heritage Weekend happening. And these are much more recent and relevant events than just listing the attractions, right? So now we have our family activity finder basically complete, and we can always make improvements to it. But I think we should give ourselves a pat on the back because we built this in about 30 minutes while covering most of the tips. So now that we have a fully working app, there's of course just best practice. We should go ahead and commit these changes to GitHub, commit to GitHub, so that the version on GitHub also has our latest backend and API changes. And while it's doing this, let's take our time and cover a few more tips in our list, right? So we're not going to do a live demo of these tips, but I just want to quickly cover them. All right. Number 16 is to create a custom slash command for repeated workflows. It's one of my favorite tips, and you can check my dedicated tutorial on it up there. All right. The next one is tip number 17. So you can ask Claude to build specialized sub-agents with name, description, and their own prompt. And each sub-agent has its own context window, so it's not going to pollute your main conversation. So for example, Anthropic engineers use sub-agents for stuff like documentation updates, security audits, and incident responses. The main agent decides when to call them. Okay, let's keep going. Tip number 18 is to set up hooks to trigger specific behavior. So hooks let you run scripts that run after Claude completes specific actions. For example, you can ask Claude to trigger a Slack notification using a hook when it has finished its work. Once again, with sub-agents and hooks, all you have to do is just ask Claude to create them, right? I want to create a hook for setting up a Slack notification. And maybe this can be a future tutorial too. All right, 2 final tips. You can install MCP servers for specialized capabilities. So useful servers include Serena for code search, Playwright, which lets Claude screenshot and test its own UI, and Figma, which is designed to prototype. So to run an MCP, just run Claude space MCP space add whatever the server is. And you can check out Anthropic's official documentation here to look at MCPs. One thing to watch out for MCPs is that it tends to load a lot of context into your prompts. So typically you don't want to have too many MCP servers running at the same time. All right, last but not least, you can also run multiple Claude sessions in parallel for faster development. So you know how in our milestone, we first built the front end and the UI, and then we built the back end. But if you really know what you're doing, if you're an engineer, you can actually use Git worktree to build both of these simultaneously with different Claude conversations. Now, I'm not advanced enough to do this, but you can check out my interview with Kieran for a live demo. All right, so now let's go back here, and it looks like Claude has committed our changes to GitHub, right? So we should be all done here. And let's just quickly end this tutorial by recapping our list of tips, okay? So here's a list. So number 1, for planning and project setup, you want to use plan mode. You want to follow the spec, to-do, and code process, right? And then you want to use output styles and Claude.md to help you learn while you're building apps. And then once you actually get to your core coding workflows, you want to use your voice to give Claude context fast. You want to get your app running as soon as possible so you can see the changes live. And if Claude starts doing something you don't want it to do, which happened quite a few times during this tutorial, just hit escape and give Claude better directions, okay? And use GitHub to add version control, set up permissions to work faster, and always follow the spec, to-do, and code process when you're building new features so that Claude will make less mistakes. And for debugging, ask Claude to think ultra hard and reflect on why things happened, and just give it a lot of context, including specific feedback, images, and browser console logs to help Claude debug issues. And last but not least, you can use advanced features like slash commands, sub-agents, and hooks. And they might be intimidating to a beginner, but really just kind of like ask Claude about them in the conversations here, and it can help you figure it out together. All right, maybe eventually I'll do an advanced tutorial on setting up MCPs and running multiple Claudes in parallel. But hopefully this tutorial gives you a complete view of all 20 tips that you can use to really master Claude Code to build apps. And as someone who is kind of a beginner and not super technical myself, Claude Code can be really intimidating, but I really do think it's worth spending time to figure it out, because at the end of the day, it's really just about you having a conversation with an AI agent. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And you can check out all the prompts and everything that I used in the description and the linked article. And please like and subscribe, and I'll make more content like this. Okay, I'll see you around.